Okay, if you're watching this, we just got kicked off. I'm going to text one of the people that was texting. There is a part 2 up. Okay, so I don't know what happened, but the network kicked me off and it stopped the recording right in the middle. So I'm going to post a part 2, and here we go. I had just finished explaining first vessel being either a vessel that was on the heat directly or had just come off and was still hot, and that vessel could cook something that was put inside of it, and that therefore if you did that on Shabbat, you'd be liable for cooking on Shabbat. And that the action of pouring has a sort of intermediate status, but is similar to still being a first vessel. Once it is inside the next vessel that it's poured into, that vessel is called a second vessel. Now, it used to be, and we saw this a little bit about the those two types of things, the old salt preserves and the Spanish tuna fish. These two items used to be seen as the only things that could cook in a second vessel. Now we do a nice little step and say the following, introducing another level of stricture. It used to be that we would say only a first vessel can cook. A second vessel can't cook except for things that are like those old salt preserves and the Spanish tuna, which those things do cook in a second vessel. Everything else doesn't. Well, then we came along and said, how do we know what those things are? It only mentions two of them, old salt preserves and Spanish tuna. How do we know that something like tea or other things that are called kalei habishul, they cook easily? How do we know that they're not like one of those things that does cook in a second vessel? And out of our concern for that, we will treat things as though they do cook in a second vessel when it comes to Shabbat, because we're concerned about not cooking on Shabbat. So what we'll actually do, now you pour one more time, and the pouring is seen as like a second vessel until it lands in the third vessel. And what we say in Jewish law is that a third vessel doesn't cook no matter what. And here's where you get divorced a little bit from physics and into more formalism of Jewish law. If you take something that just came off a hot boiling pot and you pour it directly from that pot into another vessel and immediately pour that into another vessel, although it is going to cool the food quite a bit, that could still cook a food. And what we say is we're not worried about that. We did the pourings, and now once it's in a third container, it doesn't cook even regardless of the reality in front of us. So have you ever seen people and you go to their house and they have a hot water urn that they've set up for Shabbat, tea, say, and there's a couple of cups next to the urn that seem to have no function. They're just sitting there next to the urn. That's what this is for. The urn pours the water out into the next vessel, which is seen as vessel number 2, and from the next vessel it goes into the third vessel, which is the vessel number 3, and that one can become your teacup. So even if you're worried that the tea bag being put into the hot water would cause the tea to cook on Shabbat in a way that violates the Torah, by the time it's gone from the urn to cup number 1 to cup number 2, or really the urn is cup number 1 into cup number 2 into cup number 3, that now it's a third vessel and it can never cook your tea bag because it's in a third vessel. So again, although there's a lot of formalism in that, what we've just added to our 2 points from before is that we said before we're not concerned about reheating dry foods that are fully cooked. We are concerned about reheating incompletely cooked food. We're also concerned about heating food that when it reduces, it gets better. And now we've added, we are concerned about placing a raw food inside of something that came off a heat source in case that might become cooked. But we've also said on the flip side, once it has been removed far enough from the fire, that we aren't concerned about that, no matter whether the physical reality suggests that we should be concerned about that. So from that whole first page, we've developed the broadest features possible of the prohibitions of cooking on Shabbat. And I'm not going to get into all the sources because of the time that we spent talking to this or about this, and also we lost a little bit of time in setting up the second portion of the video. But suffice it to say that the next bit can be summarized and you could read it on your own. So the next bit is from sign, oops, I wrote 353. I'll change that, it's 253, which I did write correctly in the Hebrew. 253 is the other area that food preparation is dealt with in the Shulchan Aruch. And this is what we're concerned with here, which is about an oven and about a concept that's called uvdin dechol, which is something you would do in a particular way on a weekday, a work day. You would do that action in a normal way, the way you're used to doing that action. If you did that on Shabbat, that action would violate Shabbat. And so putting food in an oven or in a heat source, on a stove, during the week, you're doing that because you're cooking. Now on Shabbat, you might do that because you're only warming the food. And then the question is, do you have to make some kind of distinction between the manner in which you warm the food on Shabbat and the manner in which you would cook the food during the week if you're using the same device? So the device they would use is called a kira. It is actually like one of those stoves with the little feeties, like a Dutch oven kind of thing. But actually, when the Talmud talks about a tanur, the word in modern Hebrew for oven, they mean like a huge oven, sometimes large enough that you could even walk inside of it. Their ovens were very large, commercial-sized ovens. And when they say oven, it's more like a kira, it's more like a Dutch oven than a classical, very, very large baker's oven. And so when we're talking about household stoves, like what we have just off camera here in my own house, we treat the household stove like we treat a kira, even though the physics is not exactly the same. So a kira was heated either underneath in a special compartment or just simply by being placed over the fire. It was heated with a heat source. And then it had in it a large space similar to what our ovens are like. You know, you could a pot or something that you would bake or cook inside of it. It could cook inside. And it also had some openings on top, and you could plunk a pot on top of one of those openings, and it's removed one level from the heat. The heat's down here below the reservoir. The reservoir has got air in it, and then you've put the pot on top of it. And that's similar to a stove top that we have today. You can see the parallels. It's not exactly the same, but it's close. My oven, which is probably manufactured, I moved in here in 2015, it was brand new. It is heated from the bottom with a middle area and a stovetop on top, just like this. So it describes what it looks like. It's a stove that's made like a pot on top of which other pots could be placed, and there's room for 2 pots. So now the Shulchan Aruch says if you heat it with good heating material, things that are going to burn well, then you cannot place, this is called Nitina l'chila. You can't put a pot of food on top of it, even while it's still Friday. I mean, I mentioned earlier in the class, even while it's still, if you cook something in advance, and I said, oh, the action that was taken was before Shabbat, and therefore you're not liable for it on Shabbat. In the case of an oven whose designed use is to cook and bake food, we actually are worried about placing it on Shabbat, even before Shabbat. And we're worried about 2 things. One is uvdin dechol. It looks like the exact same action that you would do during the week, and you may get confused and then actually cook or actually bake something when it's on Shabbat because there's no difference in the action that you're taking now, putting something on and off of this thing versus the way you do it on Shabbat. And the other concern is heitui, which is stirring the coals. You'll become impatient for the food to become ready, and you would stir the coals or turn up the knob in a modern context. You would adjust it in some way so make it cook faster, and you might do that on Shabbat because this is an object that you use during the week for that exact purpose, that we don't use that kind of tool in the same way that we would during the week on Shabbat because we're just walking so close to the line. So without going into every little jot and tittle of that source, what it says is if you rake out the coals, so now the thing is just piping hot because it was just full of hot coals, but it can't get any hotter. There's no way that you're going to stir the coals because you took them out. They're gone, right? Or if you put ash on top of the coals, and now that dampens their heat, you would be reminded now you're using it in a different way than you would use it on Shabbat. And so for a modern oven, we actually say that there's no way to achieve this by if you're putting a pot inside the oven, right? How could you scrape out the coals? Now it's an electric source or a gas source. It's not going to work for you to remove it. And most people don't even have ash around to use in this manner. So typically you have to do some other change, propping the door open in such a way that it can't close properly. Or there's a variety of Shabbat oven settings. There's a number of ways that people solve this problem. But the other way to do it is to simply deal with the stovetop only. And that hones much closer to what the Talmud expects. Don't use the middle space, because the middle space is really like cooking and baking. But if you use the top in a way that some separation has been made, that you're not exactly using it the way you would, and that the alteration that you've done is similar to this action of scraping out the coals or putting on the ash, then you can prepare food. And this is then you can heat food on Shabbat, reheat food that's not already been cooked, or place a food that is just, raw, so raw that no matter how much you stir it, and no matter how much you stir the coals, no matter how impatient you are, the thing's going to be raw all night long. It's not going to be done until the next day. Then you're also okay. So this is where foods like chillent and hamim and all of these other long developing foods, if you place it on raw Friday afternoon, you're not concerned with the possibility of stirring it on Shabbat. And then when you come to eat it the next day, it will be ready. So I'm just going to very briefly review the modern methods of food preparation, of food reheating. So first of all, as we said before, you need to be concerned about whether your food is dry or moist, and you're going to be treating it in different ways depending on that. We said that for moist foods, we didn't say it because I skipped it in the reading, but it is in the actual source that's on the sheet. If you take the pot away from the heat source, your sign that you intend to put it back to liquid food is that you're still and that if you just kind of let it go, or you set it on the ground, that you've made a pretty clear statement that you didn't mean to put it back on. And now because it's a liquid food and it gets better due to its reduction, you can't put it back on Shabbat unless you've done this mechanism of reholding it. So you do need to be concerned about whether it's a dry food or a liquid food, and whether it's cooked all the way or not, or whether its reduction will be something that is good or not. But your heat source is going to be similar no matter what. Heat source one is what's commonly known as a stovetop, and you have to put on top of it something that will achieve the status of grifa uktima. It's like you took away the heat source. And because commercial stovetops that are used for a household use, something you could just go out and buy ready-made and stick in your house, that became much more available in the 20th century and in Ashkenazi countries than it was first in the 20th century and in Ashkenazi countries, that these rules were made, and therefore the name of their solution, which is a blech, is a Yiddish word, despite the fact that Sephardim now use a blech, or a similar object to a blech. What they say is like this: if you put a pot of food directly on a burner, whether it's a gas burner or an electric burner, you're using it the same way that you would during the week. But if you put a sheet of metal between the burner and the pot that actually covers the whole stovetop, then the name of that sheet of metal in Yiddish is blech. So if you put a blech on top of your stovetop, and the burner heats the sheet metal and the sheet metal heats the pot, you're only going to do that because it's Shabbat, and therefore that's going to be like you did grifa uktima. And there are actually some people who will go one extra level, and they bend the blech down so that it covers the knobs of the stove. And that's really, if our concern is maybe you'll stir the coal and make it cook faster, the way to stir the coal on a gas or an electric oven is to turn the covers the knob and makes it so even if you reach for it, you're reminded of the sheet metal that you should not be turning the knobs, that this counts. It's like a Kira oven from which the heat source has been removed or dampened. And then you can reheat a food on top of that, either because it's a liquid food and you put it on before Shabbat, right? Or it's a solid food and you put it on and it's on top of this sheet metal. So those are blechs. There's another version of it called the Kedera blech, where they make that is heating something else and they fill it with water. And instead of being like a kira that has had the coals removed, it's like having a kira with a pot of water on it, and you put your pot of food on top of the pot of water. It's just that we've shaped the pot of water in a very nice flat way that can be placed on top of a stovetop and have food placed on top of it. That's called a kedera blech. So those are 3 ways of preparing food on a stovetop. I have to say that I have never used a blech in my own household, although my parents did use a blech in their household, and still do to this day. It seems dangerous to me, and my parents even do it in a way that's more safe than the average blech. But you have to be careful about your family's safety with these things. If you're not sure how to operate a blech in such a way that's not going to burn your house down, it would be better to use some other heat source or to go for training to someone who's grown up using a blech and knows how to do it safely. You don't want to burn things down. You don't want to lose your home. You don't want to hurt your children. You have to do this in a sane, careful, safe way. But assuming you can, they've been at it for many decades now, then this would be a way to heat up food on Shabbat, to reheat cooked food for Shabbat on this, so that at least Friday night you're not concerned with stirring it. The other type of food preparation that's very common, this is what I do use myself today since I don't really use a blech, is either a slow cooker or an electric warming plate. And in both instances, I get ones that either have a built-in timer or the amperage timer that's meant to run a large, substantial appliance so that the thing isn't actually on the entire time. Like, it's on when I need it to be on, and then it's off when I don't need it to be on, and that also reduces the danger to the house. But in these cases, you also can set them up in such a way. I generally never use a slow cooker on Shabbat or during the week, and so I'm not concerned with, am I using it the same way as I would during the week? But in general, the main difference, if you were to use them during the week, is that you're not adding food to it on Shabbat. A slow cooker is something you would have to set up before Shabbat in order to be able to use it on Shabbat. And an electric warming plate, in my case, our warmer actually does have a knob on it. And many people just cover the knobs with foil. And that sign reminds you, oh, I'm not supposed to adjust this. And that's seen as an acceptable solution. So now also we're either heating liquid food from before Shabbat or warming dry food or food with a very small amount of sauce that was completely cool. And finally, for beverages, I should mention, as I did earlier, that water is able to be cooked really easily. So we don't reheat water on Shabbat. We make sure the urn is completely on and has boiled the water before the candle lighting time, ideally, on Erev Shabbat. And then we're even more conscious of this first vessel, second vessel, third vessel thing with water, because it's so easy to place something like tea or something else inside of that water to make a beverage. And now you've cooked the stuff that beverage was made out of on Shabbat. To be very concerned about that and to use the third vessel. But there's actually a large variety of foods that can be made in this manner. Either you make it on Friday or you put it on raw Friday afternoon and follow these rules about when to take it off and so on. And as much as I've probably been talking without interruption for an hour at this point, I mentioned a lot of complicated concepts. Maybe I went too far into it. It's so doable, right? What we have is you can use your oven with some kind of alteration that makes it different from the way that you do it in the week, and a pre-cooked food or a raw food, right? Or you're using a countertop device like a warming plate or a crock pot, and you have your beverages in an urn. That's not so crazy, actually. It's just like reheating leftovers. And as much as it took us a long time to get to that conclusion, almost everything that we learned is just about how to avoid cooking on the Sabbath, either through setting things up in a way that will cause it to continue to cook, or alternatively through placing something inside of a very hot food on Shabbat, and that heat will cause the thing placed inside to cook. And indeed, the actual food preparation, other than being early and other than being slightly limited in the type of things that you can use to heat it in the exact manner in which you operate it, it's totally doable. You make your food in advance, and you have a long list of modern devices that can heat your food on Shabbat. It's probably quite a bit harder in a pre-electric age. Thank God we live in the time we do now. My position is that having learned all of this stuff, as much as it's complicated, the practicality of it is pretty simple, and it's not a big deal. If anyone wants advice or whatever, they can call me, talk to me, and I'd be happy to answer specific questions. The last part I wanted to go to a little more, but I'm going to summarize it, and it's on the sheet, and you can read it. I'm afraid we lost about 10 minutes when the feed cut off. And this has to do with travel on the Sabbath. This is a really big issue for people in an industrial age. For me to live close to Kahal Joseph, for example, close enough that I can walk on the power of my feet, which is definitely permitted on Shabbat, causes me to have to pay an awful lot of money to live where I do. And the alternative is I could live somewhere cheaper, and then I'm very far away from Kahal Joseph, and I would need some means of conveyance in order to get me to synagogue or wherever else I need to go on Shabbat. And most of those conveyances involve doing one of those 39 labors that we don't do, whether it's a bus and it's running on a combustion engine, plus the fact that you have to pay for it, and that's at least making a financial transaction is a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbat. So many cars run on a burning gas, which is one of the highest Shabbat transgressions. Then you have a bike, which for the most part people tend to view as problematic because it involves transferring the object of the bike itself and anything that's in your pockets from one domain to the next. So even if doing the bike is not a problem on Shabbat, then causing the bike to change its location on Shabbat does violate one of the 39 malachot, and you end up being left with just walking. And for some people, based on where they need to live, it's very limiting on their choice of walking options. So the only sweetening in the pudding on that one has to do with Eruvin and the ability of you to transfer objects within a domain. There really are not any long-distance travel methods that tend to be accepted in the Orthodox community. So the downside is that you're limited on your mobility. The upside is that it often causes Orthodox people to live very close to their synagogue, and this creates a sense of neighborhood feel. If you go to Pico Robertson, you feel like every second person you meet on the street is Jewish. There's so many Jewish synagogues, there's Jewish restaurants. You're surrounded by Jews because everyone wants to live within walking distance of their synagogue. And I guess if you had more means of moving around on Shabbat, that neighborhood feel would not be as strong. Okay, so that's a benefit that you get out of it. But I'll admit that travel on Shabbat, if you live outside of a Jewish area, is a significant barrier to participating in communal life on Shabbat. So what lifts that barrier a little bit is the idea of an eruv. And the eruv simply says, like if you take all these old cities like Jerusalem that have a wall around the city, the wall is a unifying thing. It makes all the domains in the city part of the same super domain. So why don't we go and we make a slight loophole? Each of these domains, the walls had gates in it. And the gates were generally seen as part of the wall, even though there's an opening in the gate. So what if we made a wall that was only gates? It was just a series of doorways There was no actual wall. It was just openings and upright pieces and cross pieces connecting those doorways. As a matter of fact, while we're making it that scant anyway, why couldn't it be something as simple as a little pole with a little wire on top, and people hardly notice? And before you know it, you have an artificial boundary that achieves the same result as a city being surrounded by a wall. And that's the halachic basis of an eruv. So what this does is, eruv means mixture. It causes an admixture of all the separate domains within that enclosure, and says that carrying objects like your house keys or your baby stroller, those are probably the two biggest things that people want to carry. They want to be able to leave the house without worrying about where they're going to put their keys, and they want to bring their children to shul. And both of these are more easily permitted when you're able to have an eruv. So in terms of mobility, that actually really increases your mobility on Shabbat, because all of a sudden you can take things with you. I brought a source here. It's a Sephardic source from Chaim David Halevi. It explains all the issues about eruvin, why they should be allowed, why they shouldn't be allowed. And he basically says, he gives you all the reasons why it should make sense, and concludes God-fearing people should be strict and not permit themselves to carry or transfer based on this idea. So that's a very clever way of nodding to both sides. If you're a very strict person looking at this source, you'd see, okay, although he goes somewhere that I'm very uncomfortable with, his conclusion at the end is like, okay, that was all theoretical, but practically don't have an eruv. On the other hand, he didn't say it was forbidden. He just said that people who are God-fearing people shouldn't do it. So it's essentially saying it's permitted to rely on it based on the reasoning that he brought forth. And that tends to be the view of eruvin in the Sephardic community. They kind of wish that we didn't have to do that, but there's a recognition that for many people, it puts the observance of Shabbat into their hands, and it's something that should be tolerated. As a rabbi, I make no compunction about saying in public on the internet, I rely on the eruv so that I can bring my children to synagogue, and I recommend that any Jew who needs that as a condition of their being able to more easily observe Shabbat should absolutely do that, and feel that you have a great man like Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who, even though he was uncomfortable with it, gave the whole case for why you should be able to have an eruv on Shabbat. And with the only caveat, I have this picture of Wyatt Cenac with his eruv hat, and he's eating a cheeseburger and dipping bacon into some milk. It's a hilarious bit on The Daily Show that you should definitely look up if you're interested in being shocked on a spiritual level. He takes it too far, right? This so-called eruv hat is like the idea, okay, anything goes once I have this eruv hat on. That's showing that people who are using the loophole as a form of abuse of the religious rules are not doing themselves or God any credit. But on the other hand, if you're doing this sincerely as a way of accessing some things on Shabbat, like synagogue, like community, like the ability to eat in other people's houses, a Shabbat social life, there's a number of things that you can get by being in an eruv that you wouldn't be able to get in any other way. I highly recommend that people do that because it makes Judaism a lot easier to observe. So my concluding thought on this, I did mention that some people say that there is one means of conveyance that's permitted if you have an eruv on Shabbat, and that is a bicycle. And I'm mentioning this because our community is Iraqi, and the person who said that that was okay is the Ben Ish Hai, Rabbeinu Yosef Haim of Baghdad. He was asked by the Jewish community in Bombay, some of whose members and descendants of those members are actually members of our community at Kahal Joseph. They said, look, there's this invention called the gari, which is basically a bicycle. It has two wheels and a chain and pedals, and you press the pedals and the wheels move, and it makes you drive around on the strength of your feet. And is this allowed on Shabbat and Yom Tov? He has a very long teshuvah, well, not very long, but pretty long teshuvah, in which he goes into the ins and outs of this. And he concludes that, especially if you have an eruv in your city, there's really not any problem with riding a bicycle. It's too bad, actually, that it happens to be that the social perception in American Judaism and in large sectors of Israeli Judaism as well is that if you do this on Shabbat, even if you have the Ben Ish Hai, you're not a real Orthodox Jew. And that's just too bad, because I do think that, like the eruv, being able to ride a bicycle on Shabbat would allow more people to access synagogue life and other things that would strengthen their Judaism. the Syrian Jews in New York and New Jersey, they rely on this, and it's totally socially appropriate in their community. I personally don't ride a bicycle on Shabbat because I don't want to have to argue with people about whether I'm a Torah observant Jew or not. And I deal with the real estate problems that come with not being able to move around. But I would say for those of you who really must have that, please do consult me or another rabbi before just going out and riding a bike on the Sabbath. But you should at least know that, especially in the Iraqi community, there is one extremely important and internationally recognized, valued and appreciated Orthodox rabbi who said that as long as there is an Eruv, it is permitted to ride your bicycle on Shabbat. So I hope that what we've seen is to learn a lot of detailed primary sources about how to prepare hot food on Shabbat and how to move around in a convenient way on Shabbat with objects in our pocket in a way that perhaps we realize how many concerns we need to weigh and keep in mind on Shabbat, but that also makes us feel confident that it's not such a big deal to handle all of those concerns and that we can do it without feeling overwhelmed. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and if you have any questions about cooking, travel, or any other issues on Shabbat, please give me a call or write me an email at rabbimelvado@kahaljoseph.org.